Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting harsh shadows across the concrete floor of Pine Valley shooting range. Sarah Chen adjusted her safety glasses for the third time, her hands trembling slightly as she gripped the unfamiliar weight of the Glock 19 in her palms. The metal felt cold and foreign against her skin, nothing like the countless hours she'd spent holding a scalpel in the operating room. Here, surrounded by the acrid smell of gunpowder and the distant echo of gunshots, from other lanes she felt completely out of her element. "You sure you've never done this before?" Marcus Williams called out from the lane beside her, his voice dripping with barely concealed amusement. He was everything Sarah wasn't in this moment. Confident, relaxed, his own weapon held with the casual familiarity of someone who'd been shooting since childhood. His expensive tactical gear and custom-engraved pistol spoke of years of experience and significant investment in the hobby. "Because you're holding that thing like it's going to bite you." Sarah's jaw tightened, but she forced herself to breathe deeply. She'd dealt with arrogant surgeons demanding patience and life-or-death situations in the ER. She could handle one condescending weekend warrior. "First time," she admitted, her voice steady despite the flutter in her stomach. "My brother thought it would be good for me to learn, given everything that's been happening in the neighborhood lately." The break-ins had started 3 months ago. 5 houses on her street, all targeting single women living alone. The police had increased patrols, but Sarah's brother David had been insistent. She needed to learn to protect herself. As a trauma surgeon, she'd seen too many victims of violence come through her doors, but she'd never imagined herself potentially becoming one of them. Marcus let out a low whistle, shaking his head with theatrical disappointment. "Oh, this should be good. Hey, Tommy," he called out to his friend in the next lane over. "Come watch this. We've got a complete newbie over here. This is going to be better than YouTube." Tommy, a thick-set man with arms covered in military tattoos, wandered over with his own weapon, hanging loosely at his side. "What's the bet? I say she doesn't hit the target at all. I'm thinking she'll be lucky if she doesn't drop the gun," Marcus replied, his laughter echoing off the concrete walls. Several other shooters had begun to glance their way, drawn by the commotion. Sarah felt heat rising in her cheeks, but she kept her focus on the target downrange, a simple black silhouette against white paper 25 yards away. Range Officer Janet Morrison had been watching the interaction from her position at the control booth, her weathered face set in a disapproving frown. At 62, she'd been running this range for over 15 years, and she'd seen every type of shooter walk through those doors. The show-offs, the genuine enthusiasts, the nervous beginners, and, unfortunately, the bullies. She'd developed a sixth sense about people, and something about this situation was setting off alarm bells in her head. Sarah took her stance, feet shoulder-width apart as she'd seen in the safety video, both hands gripping the pistol. Her heart was hammering against her ribs, and she could feel sweat beading on her forehead despite the cool air conditioning. The target seemed impossibly small and distant. She'd studied the mechanics, sight alignment, trigger control, breathing, but theory and practice were entirely different beasts. She squeezed the trigger. The recoil surprised her more than she'd expected, even after the warnings. The gun jerked upward, and she knew immediately that she'd missed. Badly. The shot had gone wide, not even scratching the paper target. The sound was deafening despite her ear protection, and the sharp smell of cordite filled her nostrils. Marcus erupted in laughter, slapping his knee with exaggerated enthusiasm. "Oh, man, that was even worse than I thought. You didn't even hit the paper. Lady, you missed a target the size of a door from 25 yards. My grandmother could do better than that, and she's been dead for 10 years, Tommy joined in, his booming laugh carrying across the range. "Maybe you should try darts instead. At least then you can't hurt anyone when you miss." The humiliation burned in Sarah's chest, but she'd learned long ago not to let emotions show in high-pressure situations. In the OR, composure could mean the difference between life and death. Here, it was about dignity and self-respect. She steadied her breathing, adjusted her grip, and prepared for her second shot. Wait, Marcus called out, still chuckling as he pulled out his phone. I gotta get this on video. My buddies are never going to believe this. A doctor who can't hit the broadside of a barn. Sarah's finger was on the trigger when Range Officer Morrison's voice cut through the air like a whip crack, amplified by the intercom system that reached every lane in the facility. Range cold. Cease fire immediately. All weapons down. Now. The authority in her voice was absolute and undeniable. Every shooter on the line immediately lowered their weapons and stepped back from the firing line. Marcus's phone slipped from his suddenly nerveless fingers, his face draining of color as he realized the range officer was looking directly at him. Lane 7, Morrison's voice continued, cold and measured. Approach the control booth. Now. Marcus swallowed hard, his earlier bravado evaporating like morning mist. The entire range had fallen silent except for the hum of the ventilation system and the distant sound of traffic outside. Sarah remained frozen in position, her weapon lowered but her heart still racing, uncertain what had just happened. Morrison stepped out of her booth, her gray hair pulled back in a severe bun, her range officer uniform impeccably maintained. She'd served 22 years in the Army before taking this job, rising to the rank of Master Sergeant, and her bearing still carried every ounce of that military precision. Her pale blue eyes were ice-cold as they fixed on Marcus, and when she spoke, her voice carried the weight of absolute authority. Son, in 15 years of running this range I've seen a lot of things, but what I will not tolerate, not for one single second, is harassment of any shooter under my watch. You want to explain to me why you thought it was appropriate to film another customer without consent. You want to tell me why you thought mockery and intimidation were acceptable behaviors on my range? Marcus's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. All his earlier confidence had vanished, replaced by the look of a man who suddenly realized he'd made a very serious mistake. It was just for fun. Fun? Morrison's voice dropped to a dangerous whisper that somehow carried across the entire range. Let me tell you what's fun, son. What's fun is watching someone learn a new skill. What's fun is helping a beginner discover they have natural talent. What's fun is building confidence instead of tearing it down. What you were doing wasn't fun. It was bullying, plain and simple. The silence stretched out, thick and uncomfortable. Sarah found herself holding her breath, watching this woman who couldn't be more than 5.5 feet tall completely dominate a man who towered over her. Now, Morrison continued, her voice carrying across the range like a drill sergeant addressing new recruits, you're going to apologize to Dr. Chen here. Then you're going to pack up your gear and leave my range. And if I ever see you treating another customer with anything less than complete respect, you'll find yourself permanently banned from this facility. Are we clear? But as Marcus stammered through what would be the most humiliating apology of his adult life, neither he nor Sarah had any idea that this moment was about to reveal something that would change everything. Something that would explain exactly why Range Officer Morrison had been watching so intently, and why Sarah's presence at the range that day was anything but coincidental. Marcus's face had turned a deep shade of red as he mumbled his way through an apology that fooled no one. I'm sorry, Dr. Chen. I shouldn't have. It was inappropriate. His voice cracked slightly on the last word, the weight of Morrison's stare making him feel like a child caught stealing cookies. Tommy had already begun packing his gear, clearly wanting no part of whatever consequences were about to rain down on his friend. Sarah nodded curtly, accepting the apology with the same professional grace she used when dealing with difficult colleagues. But her attention was increasingly drawn to Morrison, who hadn't moved from her position even after Marcus had finished speaking. The range officer's pale blue eyes were studying Sarah with an intensity that went far beyond normal customer service, as if she were trying to solve a puzzle that had been troubling her for months. Dr. Chen, Morrison said finally, her voice softer now but no less authoritative. Would you mind staying after these gentlemen have left? I'd like to speak with you privately. Something in the woman's tone sent a chill down Sarah's spine. Not fear, exactly, but the recognition that this conversation was going to be far more significant than anything that had happened so far. She watched as Marcus and Tommy gathered, their equipment with uncharacteristic haste, both men clearly eager to escape the oppressive atmosphere that had settled over Lane 7. As the door closed behind them with a metallic clang that seemed to echo forever, Morrison activated the range's security system, effectively sealing them inside. The other shooters had long since returned to their own practice, the steady percussion of gunfire resuming its rhythmic pattern, but Sarah felt as though she and Morrison were now existing in a completely separate world. 15 years I've been running this range, Morrison began, her weathered hands clasped behind her back in a military posture that seemed as natural as breathing. In that time, I've developed what you might call an eye for people. I can spot a natural shooter from 50 yards away. I can identify an undercover cop by the way they hold their weapon. I can tell the difference between someone who's here for sport and someone who's here because they're running from something. Sarah's pulse quickened, but she kept her expression neutral. I told you, this is my first time. My brother thought, your brother David Chen, detective second class with the Metropolitan Police Department, Morrison interrupted smoothly. Graduated from the academy 8 years ago, commendation for bravery in 2019, currently working robbery homicide. Unmarried, lives alone in apartment 4B at 1247 Elm Street. Drives a blue Honda Civic, license plate number DXC4729. The blood drained from Sarah's face. This level of detail went far beyond casual observation or even professional interest. Who are you? Morrison walked slowly to the small office attached to the range control booth, gesturing for Sarah to follow. The space was spartanly decorated. A metal desk, 2 chairs, a filing cabinet, and a wall covered with certificates and photographs from Morrison's military service. But it was the computer monitor that caught Sarah's attention, displaying what appeared to be a comprehensive database with her own photograph prominently featured. Dr. Sarah Chen, Morrison read from the screen, age 34, trauma surgeon at Metropolitan General Hospital. Graduated from Johns Hopkins Medical School, residency at Massachusetts General. Parents deceased, killed in automobile accident when she was 19. One sibling, the aforementioned Detective Chen. Currently residing at 892 Maple Avenue, house purchased 18 months ago following her divorce from Dr. Michael Harrison. Sarah's legs felt weak, and she gripped the back of the offered chair to steady herself. This is insane. Why do you have a file on me? What is this place really? Morrison's expression softened slightly, the first crack in her military bearing since she'd called the ceasefire. Dr. Chen, what I'm about to tell you is going to sound impossible, but I need you to listen carefully and try to keep an open mind. Your life may literally depend on it. She turned the monitor so Sarah could see it more clearly. The database was extensive, containing not just Sarah's basic information but detailed reports, photographs, and what appeared to be surveillance footage from various locations around the city. Sarah recognized images of herself leaving the hospital, grocery shopping, even walking her neighbor's dog when Mrs. Patterson had been sick last month. 3 months ago, you started receiving anonymous gifts, Morrison continued, her voice taking on the clinical tone of someone delivering a briefing. First, it was flowers delivered to the hospital with no card, then a box of expensive chocolates left on your doorstep. A bottle of wine appeared in your mailbox. Small things, easily dismissed as mistakes or random acts of kindness. Sarah's mouth went dry. The gifts had seemed odd at the time, but in the chaos of her demanding schedule she'd barely given them a second thought. How could you possibly know about those? I never reported them to anyone. Because we've been watching you, Dr. Chen. Not us, specifically, Morrison gestured around the range, but people I work with, people who are very concerned about your safety. Morrison opened a drawer in her desk and withdrew a manila folder thick with documents and photographs. She spread them across the surface, revealing a collection of images that made Sarah's knees buckle. Pictures of her house taken from various angles, photos of her car in the hospital parking garage, images of her walking through the grocery store. But most disturbing were the close-up shots. Someone had been following her closely enough to capture her expression as she read a text message, the title of the book she'd been reading in the hospital cafeteria, even her reflection in store windows as she'd walked past. "These photographs weren't taken by us," Morrison said grimly. "These were found in the apartment of Vincent Carrera, a man who's been obsessed with you for the past 6 months, a man who's escalated from anonymous gifts to active stalking, and who we believe is responsible for the break-ins in your neighborhood." Sarah sank into the chair, her professional composure finally cracking under the weight of this revelation. The break-ins. He was looking for me? Not looking for you exactly. He was studying you, learning your routines, your habits, your preferences. The houses he broke into all belonged to women who shared certain physical characteristics with you: dark hair, petite build, professional careers. He was practicing, Dr. Chen, getting ready for the real thing. Morrison pulled out a final photograph, and Sarah's blood turned to ice in her veins. It was a picture of herself from just that morning, taken as she'd entered the shooting range. She was clearly identifiable, and someone had drawn red circles around her head and torso. In the margin, written in a cramped handwriting, were the words, "Today is the day." "Vincent Carrera was released from psychiatric custody 48 hours ago," Morrison continued, her voice deadly serious. "He's violated his restraining order, disappeared from his halfway house, and according to our intelligence, he's planning to make contact with you very soon. The question, Dr. Chen, is whether you're going to be ready for him when he does." Sarah stared at the photograph, her mind reeling. Everything she'd thought she knew about her quiet, predictable life had just been shattered. "You said, our intelligence. Who exactly are you people? This isn't just a shooting range, is it?" Morrison smiled for the first time since she'd called the ceasefire, but it was a cold, calculating expression that didn't reach her eyes. "Dr. Chen, welcome to the most exclusive shooting club in the city. We specialize in training people who have very specific reasons to learn how to defend themselves. People whose lives depend on accuracy under pressure." She stood up and moved to a section of the wall that Sarah had assumed was simply decorated with military memorabilia. Morrison pressed something hidden behind a framed commendation, and the entire panel slid aside, revealing a doorway that led into what appeared to be a much larger, more sophisticated facility. "The Pine Valley shooting range is just our public face," Morrison explained, gesturing toward the hidden entrance. "What lies beyond this door is something else entirely. And Dr. Chen, based on what we know about Vincent Carrera's plans, you're going to need every bit of training we can give you if you want to survive the next 72 hours. Sarah's legs felt like they were made of water as she followed Morrison through the concealed doorway. The contrast was immediate and startling. Where the public range had been utilitarian concrete and fluorescent lighting, this hidden facility was something out of a high-tech thriller. The corridors were lined with sound-dampening materials. The lighting was warm and indirect, and the air hummed with the quiet efficiency of advanced ventilation systems. "How long has this been going on?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper as they walked past rooms filled with equipment she couldn't begin to identify. Through reinforced glass windows she caught glimpses of sophisticated computer setups, what appeared to be a medical facility, and training areas that looked nothing like the simple shooting lanes she'd just left behind. "The organization has existed in various forms for over 30 years, Morrison replied, her footsteps echoing softly on the polished floor. "We identify individuals who are facing extreme personal threats: stalkers, domestic abusers, organized crime targets, witnesses in protection, people who fall through the cracks of traditional law enforcement, who need more than what the system can provide." They stopped in front of a door marked Briefing Room C, and Morrison's hand hesitated on the handle. "Dr. Chen, before we go in here, I need you to understand something. Once you walk through this door, once you learn what we know about Vincent Carrera and what he's planning, there's no going back to your normal life. At least, not until this is resolved. Are you prepared for that?" Sarah thought about the photographs spread across Morrison's desk, the image of herself with red circles drawn around her vital organs, the words, "Today is the day," written in that cramped, obsessive handwriting. She thought about the break-ins, the anonymous gifts she dismissed so casually, and the growing certainty that her world had been carefully infiltrated by someone she'd never even met. "I don't think I have a choice," she said finally. Morrison nodded grimly and opened the door. The briefing room was occupied by 3 other people, all of whom looked up as Sarah entered. There was a woman about her own age with short auburn hair and intelligent green eyes, wearing what appeared to be tactical clothing. Next to her sat a man in his 50s with graying temples and the kind of weathered face that spoke of years spent in dangerous places. At the head of the table was someone Sarah recognized with a shock that made her grab the doorframe for support. "Hello, Sarah," said Detective David Chen, her brother, rising from his chair with an expression of profound guilt and worry etched across his features. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." Sarah stared at him, her mind struggling to process this latest, impossible revelation. "David, what are you doing here? How are you? You knew about this." "Sit down, please," the auburn-haired woman said gently, gesturing to an empty chair. "I know this is overwhelming, but we have a lot to cover, and very little time. I'm Agent Sarah Connor with a federal task force that doesn't officially exist. This is Agent Martinez," she indicated the older man. "And I believe you already know Detective Chen." Sarah remained standing, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. "I don't understand any of this. David, you told me to learn how to shoot, because of the break-ins. You said it would be good for me to know how to protect myself. You never said anything about stalkers or secret organizations or—" "Because I couldn't," David exploded, his composure finally cracking. "Because if I'd told you the truth 3 months ago, you would have done exactly what any rational person would do. You'd have gone to the police, filed a report, maybe gotten a restraining order, and Vincent Carrera would have disappeared into the wind, only to resurface months or years later when we weren't watching, when you weren't prepared." Agent Connor leaned forward, her expression serious but not unkind. "Dr. Chen, your brother has been working with us since the first anonymous gift arrived at your hospital. We've been building a case against Carrera, but more importantly, we've been preparing for this moment, when he would finally make his move." "Preparing for what, exactly?" Sarah demanded, finally sinking into the offered chair. "What kind of move? What's he planning to do?" Agent Martinez slid a tablet across the table to her. The screen displayed a series of text messages, email drafts, and what appeared to be a detailed timeline written in the same cramped handwriting she'd seen on her photograph. As she read, her face grew progressively paler. The messages were addressed to her, though they'd never been sent. Hundreds of them, spanning months, chronicling Vincent Carrera's growing obsession in disturbing detail. He knew her schedule down, to the minute, knew which days she worked late, knew that she always stopped for coffee at the same shop on Tuesday mornings. He'd documented her preferences, her habits, even her emotional state as observed from a distance. But it was the timeline that made her blood run cold. It was laid out like a military operation, with contingencies and backup plans, multiple scenarios for what he called our first real meeting. Some of the scenarios involved approaching her at the hospital. Others described elaborate plans for getting into her house. The most recent entries, dated just days ago, focused on a single location, Pine Valley Shooting Range. "He knows I'm here," Sarah whispered, looking up at the faces around the table. "He knows I came here today." "We know. He knows," Agent Connor said quietly. "In fact, we've been encouraging his surveillance. Your brother's suggestion that you learn to shoot wasn't random, Dr. Chen. We've been guiding Vincent toward this confrontation because this facility gives us every possible advantage." Morrison, who had been standing silently by the door, finally spoke up. "Dr. Chen, Vincent Carrera isn't just obsessed with you. He's a highly intelligent, methodical individual with a background in electronics and surveillance. He's been planning this approach for months, and he's not going to be deterred by restraining orders or police patrols. The only way to end this is to meet him on our terms, in a place where we control every variable." Sarah's hands were shaking as she set the tablet down. "You're talking about using me as bait. We're talking about giving you the tools to survive," David said, his voice thick with emotion. "Sarah, this man has killed before. The woman in Portland 2 years ago. The one in Denver before that. The police couldn't prove it, but we know it was him. He fixates on women who remind him of someone from his past, and when he can't have them." He couldn't finish the sentence. Agent Martinez pulled up a new file on his laptop and turned the screen toward her. "Vincent Carrera, age 38, diagnosed with obsessive-compulsive disorder and paranoid schizophrenia. Multiple hospitalizations, but he's highly functional when medicated. The problem is, he's been off his medication for 6 weeks. His psychiatrist believes he's entering what they call a crisis phase, a period where his delusions become so overwhelming that he's likely to act on them regardless of consequences." Sarah studied the photograph on the screen. Vincent Carrera looked surprisingly ordinary. Medium height, thinning brown hair, soft features that wouldn't stand out in a crowd, but his eyes held an intensity that made her skin crawl, even in a static photograph. "The break-ins in your neighborhood weren't random," Agent Connor continued. "He was testing security systems, learning police response times, studying the layout of houses similar to yours. But more than that, he was escalating. Each break-in lasted longer than the previous one. He was getting more comfortable, more confident. And now he's ready for the real thing," Morrison added. "Our surveillance indicates he's been in position since early this morning, watching the range. He knows you're here, and he knows you're alone. What he doesn't know is that this entire facility has been prepared for his arrival." Sarah looked around the room at these people who had been orchestrating her life from the shadows, making decisions about her safety and her future without her knowledge or consent. Part of her was furious at the deception, at the way her own brother had manipulated her into this situation. But another part, the part that had seen too many victims roll through the emergency room doors, understood the brutal mathematics of survival. "What exactly are you asking me to do?" she said finally. Agent Connor exchanged glances with Morrison before answering. "We're asking you to finish your shooting lesson. We're asking you to walk out of this range at your normal pace, get into your car, and drive toward home. And we're asking you to trust that when Vincent Carrera makes his move, and he will make his move in the next few hours, you'll be ready for him." Morrison stepped forward, her military bearing more pronounced than ever. "Dr. Chen, I've trained hundreds of people over the years. Soldiers, law enforcement officers, civilians facing extraordinary circumstances. What I'm about to teach you in the next 2 hours usually takes months to learn. But you have 2 advantages that most people don't. You're already comfortable, making life-and-death decisions under pressure, and you have excellent fine motor control from your surgical training." Sarah closed her eyes, trying to process everything she had learned in the past hour. When she opened them again, her expression was calm and resolute, the same look she wore when a trauma patient's life hung in the balance. "Then, let's get started," she said. "Because if Vincent Carrera thinks he's going to turn me into another victim, he's about to learn that he picked the wrong surgeon to obsess over." But as Morrison led her toward what appeared to be the most sophisticated training facility she'd ever seen, none of them knew that Vincent Carrera had been listening to every word they'd spoken through a device he'd planted months ago, or that his original plan had just evolved into something far more dangerous and personal than anyone could have anticipated. 2 hours later, Sarah stood in what Morrison called the reality chamber, a room that could simulate virtually any environment with holographic projectors, moving targets, and even scent generators that could replicate the smell of gunpowder, fear sweat, or urban decay. Her hands, once trembling with inexperience, now held the Glock with steady confidence. The weapon that had felt foreign and unwieldy now seemed like an extension of her own body. Scenario 7, Morrison called out from the control booth. Multiple targets, low visibility, civilian presence. Remember, breathe, identify, engage. The room plunged into darkness, then flickered to life as a nighttime street scene materialized around Sarah. She could hear her own heartbeat, steady and controlled, as 3 figures emerged from the shadows. 2 were clearly threats. Armed men moving with predatory intent. The 3rd was a woman in a hospital uniform, cowering behind an overturned car. Sarah's response was automatic now. Double tap to center mass on the first target, pivot and acquire. The second, engage while moving to cover. Both threats neutralized in under 4 seconds, the civilian unharmed. The simulation faded, leaving her standing alone in the empty room, smoke still rising from her weapon's barrel. Remarkable, Agent Connor's voice came through the intercom. Dr. Chen, what you've accomplished in 2 hours typically takes our trainees 2 months. Morrison wasn't exaggerating about your advantages. Your surgical precision and ability to function under extreme stress have translated perfectly to tactical situations. But Sarah barely heard the praise. Something was wrong. Throughout the intensive training session, she'd been aware of a nagging sensation, like a persistent itch she couldn't scratch. At first, she'd attributed it to stress, to the overwhelming nature of everything she'd learned. Now, as she stood in the quiet aftermath of the simulation, she realized what had been bothering her. The air conditioning, she said suddenly, looking up at the nearest vent. It's been running continuously, but the airflow pattern changed about 20 minutes ago. Someone adjusted the system from outside this room. Morrison's voice came through the speaker, sharp with new alertness. What do you mean? Sarah moved to the wall, studying the ventilation grate. Her medical training had made her acutely aware of air circulation systems. Too many OR infections had been traced to compromised ventilation. The flow was coming from the northwest corner initially. Now it's coming from due north, and there's a chemical component that wasn't there before, something with a petroleum base. In the control booth, Morrison was already pulling up building schematics on her computer, her face grim. Connor, get Martinez down to the mechanical room, now. Agent Connor's response crackled through the radio. Roger that, but Janet, we've got a bigger problem. Building security just went dark. All exterior cameras, motion sensors, everything, and the main power grid just switched to backup systems. Sarah felt the familiar calm that always descended when a crisis reached its peak. The same deadly focus that allowed her to perform 8-hour surgeries or work through mass casualty events now sharpened her awareness to a laser point. He's here, isn't he? Vincent's not waiting for me to leave. He's coming in. Morrison's voice was steady but urgent. Dr. Chen, I need you to listen carefully. The facility has multiple exit routes, but they're all controlled by the main security system. If he's compromised that... The lights cut out, plunging the reality chamber into absolute darkness. Emergency lighting kicked in a moment later, bathing everything in an eerie red glow that made the empty room look like a scene from hell. Sarah. David's voice came through her earpiece, filled with panic. Sarah, can you hear me? The whole communication system is going haywire. Something's jamming our frequencies. She pressed the talk button on her radio. I'm here, David. I'm okay. Listen to me. His voice was strained, distorted by static. Morrison says Vincent got into the building through the old storm drain system. He's been planning this for months, maybe longer. He knew about the facility, knew about our security measures. This isn't random. He wanted you to learn to fight back. He wanted you to be armed. The realization hit Sarah like a physical blow. He wants a challenge. All those other women, they couldn't fight back. But me... He's turned this into a game. David's voice confirmed her worst fears. A hunt where both sides are armed. Morrison thinks he's rigged the entire building. We can't get to you, and you can't get out through normal exits. Sarah checked her weapon, feeling the solid weight of 2 spare magazines in her tactical vest. Morrison had insisted on the body armor, and now she understood why. Then I go to him instead of waiting for him to come to me. Sarah, no, you can't. She switched off the radio. In the OR, there came a moment in every difficult surgery where you had to stop listening to other people's fears and trust your own instincts. This felt exactly the same. The facility's layout was burned into her memory from the briefing. Vincent would expect her to try to escape, to run for the exits or hide in a defensive position. Instead, she began moving through the corridors toward the center of the building, toward the main control room where he would have had to go to compromise their systems. The emergency lighting cast dancing shadows on the walls, and every corner could conceal a threat. But Sarah found herself moving with fluid confidence, the weapon held in perfect shooting stance, her breathing controlled and quiet. Morrison's crash course had awakened something in her. Not just the ability to shoot, but the warrior mindset needed to survive when violence was inevitable. She was halfway to the control room when she heard it. Classical music, playing softly, from speakers throughout the building. Pachelbel's Canon in D major, the piece that had been playing during her first surgery as a resident. The piece she'd mentioned in a casual conversation with a colleague months ago, never knowing that Vincent had been close enough to overhear. "Very good, Dr. Sarah Chen." Vincent's voice came through the facility's PA system, cultured and calm. "You're not running. I'm impressed. The others always ran." Sarah kept moving, using the music to mask her footsteps. The others weren't trauma. Surgeons, Vincent. They didn't spend their careers elbow deep in other people's blood, fighting to keep them alive when everyone else had given up. His laughter echoed through the corridors, genuinely delighted. "Oh, you're perfect. Do you know how long I've been looking for someone like you? Someone who wouldn't break immediately, who could provide actual stimulation?" "I know about Portland," Sarah called out, pausing at a junction to check both directions. "I know about Denver. Those women couldn't fight back, so you got bored. Is that it?" Bored. The word carried a note of genuine offense. "Dr. Chen, you misunderstand me entirely. I didn't kill them because I was bored. I killed them because they disappointed me, because they weren't strong enough to be worthy of my attention." Sarah had reached the control room. The door was standing open, and she could see the banks of monitors inside, most showing static or error messages. But she could also see movement in the shadows, a figure waiting in the darkness beyond the screens. "But you," Vincent's voice continued, now coming from inside the room rather than the speakers, "you've exceeded every expectation. 2 hours of training, and you're moving through this facility like you were born for combat. You're not just defending yourself, you're hunting me." Sarah stepped through the doorway, her weapon raised and ready. Vincent Carrera stood 20 feet away, partially concealed behind a server rack, his own pistol held with practiced ease. In person, he was even more ordinary-looking than his photograph had suggested, but his eyes held a fevered intensity that made her skin crawl. "Here's what's going to happen," he said conversationally, as if they were discussing dinner plans. "We're going to have our conversation, the one I've been planning for months. And then we're going to see which one of us is truly worthy of survival. Your friends upstairs think they're in control, but they're not. The building is sealed, the communications are jammed, and I've planted enough explosive charges to ensure that this ends exactly the way I want it to." Sarah kept her weapon trained on him, but didn't fire. Something in his posture, his positioning, told her he wanted her to shoot first. This was still part of his game, his need to make this a fair fight rather than an execution. "You know what? The difference is between you and me, Vincent," she said, her voice steady and calm. "You've spent months studying me, learning my habits, planning this confrontation. But I've spent years studying death. I've seen what it looks like when it comes fast, when it comes slow, when it comes for people who deserve it and people who don't." She took a step forward, closing the distance between them. "And I've learned that death doesn't care about your plans, your intelligence, or your obsessions. It only cares about who's faster, who's more determined, and who has more to lose. Vincent's smile faltered slightly. You think you have more to lose than I do? I know I do, Sarah replied, taking another step. Because you've already lost everything that matters. Your sanity, your humanity, your connection to anything real. You're already dead, Vincent. You just haven't figured it out yet. The shot, when it came, was so fast that the sound seemed to come after the muzzle flash. Sarah's 2 hours of intensive training had compressed months of skill development into pure instinct, and her shot placement was surgical in its precision, not center mass, as Morrison had taught her, but a deliberate shoulder hit that spun Vincent around and sent his weapon skittering across the floor. He collapsed against the server rack, clutching his wounded arm, his face a mixture of pain and something that might have been admiration. Why? He gasped. Why not kill me? You had a clear shot. Sarah kept her weapon trained on him as she moved to secure his gun, her movements quick and professional. Because I'm a doctor, Vincent. My job is to save lives, not take them, even yours. She activated her radio with her free hand. Control, this is Sarah. Target is down and secured. I'm going to need a medical kit. He's got a through and through. GSW to the left shoulder, but the bleeding is controlled. Morrison's voice crackled through the static, filled with relief and amazement. Copy that, Dr. Chen. Medical team is en route. But Sarah, the building is still rigged with explosives. Can you get Vincent to tell us where they are? Sarah looked down at Vincent, who was watching her with a strange mixture of defeat and fascination. The explosives, Vincent. Where are they? He was quiet for a long moment, studying her face in the red emergency lighting. Finally, he began to laugh. Not the maniacal laughter of a movie villain, but the quiet chuckle of someone who had just understood a particularly clever joke. There are no explosives, Dr. Chen, he said softly. I lied about sealing the building, about jamming the communications. Your friends could have reached you any time they wanted. I just needed you to believe you were completely alone, that you had to face me without help. I needed to see what you would become when everything was stripped away. Sarah stared at him, the implication slowly sinking in. You wanted to see if I was strong enough to kill you. I wanted to see if you were strong enough to choose not to, he corrected. Anyone can pull a trigger when they're afraid, but to wound instead of kill, to show mercy when you have every reason for revenge, that takes a strength I've never encountered before. The sound of running footsteps echoed through the corridors as Morrison and the medical team finally reached the control room. Sarah lowered her weapon, suddenly feeling the weight of everything that had happened settling on her shoulders like a physical burden. Dr. Chen, Morrison said as she surveyed the scene, I have to ask, how did you know he was lying about the explosives? Sarah looked down at Vincent, who was now being tended to by the medical team with professional efficiency. Because he didn't want to win, she said quietly. He wanted to find someone who could beat him and choose not to, someone who could show him that there was still something human left in the world worth preserving. As the paramedics loaded Vincent onto a stretcher, he caught her eye one last time. Dr. Chen, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Thank you. Sarah watched him disappear down the corridor, then turned to Morrison with a weary smile. You know what the really crazy part is? I think I actually learned something important today, just not what any of us expected. Morrison raised an eyebrow. And what's that? That sometimes the most dangerous person in the room isn't the one who's quickest to pull the trigger, Sarah replied. It's the one who's strong enough not to. 3 months later, Dr. Sarah Chen stood once again in the Pine Valley shooting range, but this time she was wearing an instructor's badge and teaching a class of nervous beginners. Among her students was Marcus Williams, who had returned with a sincere apology and a genuine desire to learn not just marksmanship, but the responsibility that came with it. And in a secure psychiatric facility across the state, Vincent Carrera worked daily with therapists and doctors, slowly rebuilding his connection to humanity with the help of letters from the woman who had chosen to save his life rather than end it. It would be a long road back to sanity, but for the first time in years, he had hope that the journey was possible. Sometimes, Sarah reflected as she watched her students concentrate on their targets, the most important shot you could take was the one you chose not to fire.